Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peter Goddard, Director of the Institute for Advanced Study, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon to this Institute lecture. After the lecture, there will be a reception to which you're all invited in Ford Hall. Today our speaker is Yve-Alain Bois. Yve-Alain has been a professor of the history of art in the School of Historical Studies here at the Institute since 2005. Yve-Alain obtained his PhD in Paris in 1977 and held a research position there with the CNRS before joining the faculty of the Johns Hopkins University in 1983. In 1991, he moved to Harvard as Joseph Pulitzer Jr. Professor of Modern Art, and he was chair of the Department of the History of Art and Architecture at Harvard from 2002 until he came here in 2005. Yve-Alain specializes in the study of 20th century European and American art, and he is an internationally recognized expert on a wide range of artists from Matisse and Picasso to Mondrian, Barnett Newman, and Ellsworth Kelly. And he's curated a number of influential exhibitions, including ones on Mondrian and on Matisse and Picasso. He's a Chevalier des Arts et des Lettres and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Today, his subject is the difficult task of erasing oneself, non-composition in 20th century art.
Thank you, Peter. I shall start with a quotation, a fairly long one, I'm afraid. So I'll tell you when it stops. Paintings and sculptures are the last handmade personal objects within our culture. Almost everything else is produced industrially, in mass, and through a high division of labor. Few people are fortunate enough to make something that represents themselves, that issues entirely from their hands and mind, and to which they can affix their names. Most work, even much scientific work, requires a division of labor, a separation between the individual and the final result. The personality is hardly present even in the operations of industrial planning or in management and trade. Standardized objects produced impersonally and in quantity establish no bond between maker and user. They are mechanical products with only a passing and instrumental value. What is most important is that the practical activity by which we live is not satisfying. We cannot give it full loyalty, and its rewards do not compensate enough for the frustrations and emptiness that arise from the lack of spontaneity and personal identification in work. The individual is deformed by it, only rarely does it permit him to grow. The object of art is, therefore, more passionately than ever before, the occasion of spontaneity or intense feeling. The painting symbolizes an individual who realizes freedom and deep engagement of the self within his work. It is addressed to others who will cherish it if it gives them joy, and we will recognize in it an irreplaceable quality and will be attentive to every mark of the maker's imagination and feeling. The consciousness of the personal and spontaneous in the painting and sculpture stimulates the artist to invent devices of handling, processing, surfacing, which confer to the utmost degree the aspect of the freely made. Hence, the great importance of the mark, the stroke, the brush, the quality of the substance of the paint itself, and the surface of the canvas as a texture and field of operation. All signs of the artist's active presence. End of quote. I am not familiar enough with 19th century criticism to know if such an argument was used by the defenders of Monet and Impressionism. But it could have been. For the idea that art was at least the last subjective refuge against the standardization of life promoted by the industrialization of labor had already been clamored by men of a previous generation, such as the poet Charles Baudelaire. And the rhetoric of spontaneity was certainly exploited fairly early on by Monet's advocates, then a little further on by his dealer, to the point that the aspect of the freely made became a prerequisite of its production and a guarantee of its commercial success. By the end of the 1880s, there are enough amateurs to cherish the air of freedom of Monet's work, and he is finally on his way to become a very rich man. 3 days after the opening of his Haystacks exhibition in 1891, all the canvases are sold. Sometimes, we might even note, this aspect of the freely made had to be faked. Indeed, Robert Herbert has shown that the gestuality of Monet's canvases was elaborately staged from the early 1870s on, a tumultuous impastoed ground on textural strokes being first built before an independent lawyer of surface color was applied onto it. However, if I say that the quotation I've made could have referred to Monet, it is precisely because it does not. These lines were penned by mayorship hero in 1957. His essay, The Liberating Quality of Avant-Garde Art, appeared with a group of articles celebrating the 55th anniversary of Art News, along with Marcel Duchamp's ironical statement on the Creative Act. Although the only reproduction illustrating Shapiro's text was a black and white watercolor by Jackson Pollock, dating from 1951, and although I cheated and eliminated the word drip from the quotation, Shapiro had written the great importance of the mark, the stroke, the brush, the drip, etc. I think that he had rather de Kooning in mind when he wrote it, not only because they were intimate friends, but also because it is de Kooning, far more than Pollock, who was very swiftly canonized, above all in Art News, for his valorization of the brushstroke as autograph, as a mark of spontaneity, originality, authenticity, and presence. And it is de Kooning's art, not that of Pollock, that was imitated ad nauseam during the 50s by an army of young painters, eulogized once again by Art News, and long forgotten today, to the point that the aspect of the freely made, at first conceived as a resistance against industrialization, had become itself robotized. I shall not elaborate here on the rapid canonization of Willem de Kooning and on the stark contrast it makes with the early reception of Pollock, nor with the process of academization I just mentioned. Suffice here to say that while Pollock's ambiguous position with regard to the amount of control he had on the making of his pictures, fueled by his remarks on automatism and exacerbated by what one knew about his drip process, that while Pollock's ambiguity with regard to this issue profoundly disturbed reviewers, de Kooning was hailed as having mastered his new pictorial freedom and making good use of it, keeping both pigment and stroke always fresh, spontaneous, and the whole image under rigorous control. That was Tom Hess in Art News again in 1951. I shall not elaborate either on the specific issue of the autographic gesture upon which Shapiro dwells so eloquently, but rather on his remark about what it implies, that modernism is a period of the history of art during which a particular accent was deliberately placed on agency. The autographic gesture is only a particular symptom of this tendency, the most patent one, which is why I started with it. But there are many other traits by which an artist can affirm his or her presence, his or her subjective mastery of the canvas as a field of operation. Modernist art, tells Shapiro and many others, is the one in which the subjectivity of the artist, his or her free will, has become paramount. This represents, in fact, the first serious account of modernism to have been elaborated. If, for brevity's sake, one takes the standard Greenbergian definition of modernism as a self-critical enterprise through which each art was engaged in defining the limits of its own medium, one can trace the genealogy of this self-defining mode to the circle of what is now called Jena Romanticism. Though it did not consist of artists, but poets and writers, grouped around the Schlegel brothers, its activity is worth noting here for its journal, the Athenaeum, which was published in Germany from 1798 to 1800, constitutes perhaps the first avant-garde publication ever. Its authors endeavored to define literature as such, literature as absolute, independently of any qualifications of genre. And this was a radical move at the time, if one is to think of the trouble Manet went through almost 3/4 of a century later, in part for having disregarded the academic taxonomy of pictorial genres and national schools in works such as his Déjeuner sur l'herbe of 1863, and tried to construct instead, so goes the modernist interpretation of this work, painting as such. But I want to underline here, with this brief historical recall, is that even at the very beginning of its formation as an ontological discourse, even when it was beginning to conceive of itself as what I would call a discourse of motivation, modernism heralded the singularity of authorship as its touchstone. Speaking about poetry, that is about language as literature, as opposed to everyday prose, the authors of the Athenaeum propose that, I quote, its very first law is that the arbitrariness of the poet does not suffer any law above him. But was this apotheosis of the author the only possible anchor for the modernist search for the absolute? My answer to this question, of course, is negative. In The Search for the Absolute, Jean-Paul Sartre's most famous text on art is prefaced to the exhibition of Alberto Giacometti at the Pierre Matisse Gallery in New York in January 1948, a rather non, if not anti-modernist text, which I quote here only ironically. Sartre notes that the sculptor knows that there is nothing superfluous in man. But what if it is man himself, who was deemed superfluous? In fact, it is my contention that a good portion of the modernist production throughout this past century tried to ask this very question, tried to conceive of itself as a search for the possibility of effacing man and erasing his traces. Opposing Monet's brandishing his personal brushstrokes, there is Seurat's little dots, a method that is perfectly legible, as Shapiro notes. Furthermore, Seurat discards, as a true utopianist he was, the distinction between an artistic mode of production that would be spontaneous and free, and that governing the making of any other objects in the world at large. I quote again Shapiro. When asked the price of a picture, The Posers, Seurat wrote that he was very much embarrassed in fixing the price, that he reckoned it as 1 year's work at 7 francs a day, but that he would be willing to reduce it if he liked the personality of the buyer. Thus, Seurat rationalized even his own labor at the sum of units of work, in contrast to his contemporaries who identified every stroke with the experience of a lifetime or the priceless effect of inspired genius. End of quote. After Monet, we have Seurat, and after de Kooning, we have Bob Rauschenberg effacing one of his senior's drawings with great difficulty during 3 whole weeks with no fewer than 15 different kinds of erasers, we are told, de Kooning having elected to give him a drawing that would be particularly hard to erase. But after de Kooning's work, or even contemporaneously with it, we have this painting, dating from 1953, most appropriately called 16 Squares, for it consists of a black grid of 6 straight lines delimiting, together with the limits of the white canvas, the said number of squares. The painter is François Morellet, a French artist still extremely active today, and whose work has been concerned from the early 50s on with the possibility of expunging man and, above all, of deleting any evidence of the artist himself. It is quite possible that when he painted this work, and others in a similar vein, Morellet thought that he had reached a threshold, that he had managed at last to eradicate all subjectivity from art, that he had leapt into pure objectivity, attained that very level of impersonality and universality that many artists had sought from Seurat on. If so, then Morellet must have admitted his mistake at some point. He must have recognized that his feeling of triumph had been the result of wishful thinking. Whatever the case, here's what he wrote about the canvas in 1980, almost 30 years after painting it. It's another long quote, but this one is funny, I think funny. This picture was produced by a certain number of choices. Choice of format, choice of the elements appearing in it, choice of how they are distributed, choice of colors, and choice of texture. The format. I chose the square because it is a figure which is defined by only one arbitrary decision, as opposed to the 2 required for a rectangle. This decision, the 80 centimeter inside, is admittedly subjective, but in a very watered-down way, given that it was applied to 9/10 of what I produced in the 50s. So that makes 2 decisions, square plus 80 centimeters. The elements appearing in it. I chose line because, given a plane, the picture, a line is defined theoretically by its sole direction. For example, the angle it forms with the horizontal, here the two extremes, 0 degrees, 90 degrees, and practically by its thickness, here 2 millimeters. Another arbitrary decision involves the number of them, here 6. So that makes 5 decisions. Line plus 0 degrees, plus 90 degrees, plus 2 millimeters, plus 6. Distribution. I chose the most uniform, that is, the same spacing between each line, 20 centimeters. Just one decision here. Colors, I chose the two extremes with regard to the absorption and refraction of light, black and white, 2 decisions. Texture, I chose a smooth texture. In geometry, a surface can only be flat, 1 decision. Overall, that makes 2 plus 5 plus 1 plus 2 plus 1, 11 decisions. Not bad. Just 1 second. I have to. Whoop. This long quotation is precious on 3 counts. First, it reintroduces the notion of arbitrariness as a synonym of subjective choice, a notion that had already emerged, as we have seen, in the pages of the Athenaeum. In doing so, it immediately evokes motivation, which is a logical antonym of arbitrariness, and it allows a reading of the modernist search for the absolute as a search for the motivated. Second, it gives a clear-cut example of what it means for an artist to try to eliminate from his art any subjectivity or arbitrariness. And finally, it reveals that such a task might be an impossible one. Morelet's absurd accounting is striking indeed. 11 arbitrary decisions to produce this modular grid, so bland, so anonymous looking. In terms of the modernist search for the motivated, that's 10 too many. The only fully justifiable decision being, in such a program, that of painting or of sculpting, so to speak, the ultimate picture or sculpture. But there is another question raised by Morelet's eminently simple canvas. 16 Squares was made in 1953, but would it not look odd in a room filled with works that are its strict contemporaries, a Giacometti, of course, or a Woman by de Kooning? Wouldn't it look more at ease in the company, say, of a minimalist grid, such as a floor piece by Carl André dating from the late 60s? And does this mean that Morelet is a precursor of minimalism, something this artist has in fact occasionally believed himself? Or, to go in the reverse direction, could not 16 Squares have been paid in 1930, perhaps as an illustration of Theo van Doesburg's call for an art that would be entirely calculated before its realization, so as to suppress all remnants of humanism, all artistic and writing? This is a painting by van Doesburg done in 1930 called Arithmetic Composition, and the sketch that led to it. Painting which is done in the manner of Jack the Ripper can interest only detectives, criminologists, psychologists, and psychiatrists, wrote van Doesburg. Is not such a virulently anti-subjective statement similar to that of Morelet, minus the humor? In other words, what is the historical status of a work like 16 Squares, a work which, in a way, is little more than a ready-made? This is the type of question that Carl André demands of us when he told his friend Hollis Frampton on November 4th, 1962, that Frank Stella was a constructivist. Puzzlement of Frampton. But why constructivist? You flood me with a yellowed celluloid of Gabot and Pevsner. Frampton was right to be puzzled, of course. Indeed, 2 years later, in Bruce's Glaser's famous interview with Judd and Stella, the latter would entirely dismiss the constructivist heritage. But Frampton was also wrong, as his and Stella's disregard for Russian constructivism was based on a gross misconception extremely common at the time and only beginning to wither today, that the brotherly pair of Gabot and Pevsner represented the movement's most important voice. I quote Carl André again. Frank Stella is a constructivist. He makes paintings by combining identical, discrete units. Those units are not stripes, but brushstrokes. We have both watched Frank Stella paint a picture. He's still speaking to Frampton. He fills in a pattern with uniform elements. His stripe designs are the result of the shape and limitation of his primary unit. A brick wall is a constructivist execution. The various overall bond patterns are a result of the shape of the individual bricks. My constructivism is a generation of overall designs by the multiplication of the qualities of the individual constituent element. In this generation of overall designs by the multiplication of the qualities of the individual constituent elements, one recognizes, of course, what was going to become the landmark of Carl André's sculpture, a mode of assembling the sculptural object that he had already begun to explore in 1959 with Pyramid, a sculpture now lost but realized in Frank Stella's studio while the painter was undergoing his groundbreaking series of black paintings. And besides Pyramid, I'll show you a small sculpture dating also from the same time, from 1959 by Carl André, and you'll see for why in 1 second. But André was referring as well to the work of Gabo's arch-enemy, Alexandr Rodchenko, particularly his modular sculptures of 1921, of which precious little was known at the time. Even though I will not come up with any new interpretation, it is worth retelling the story of these works by Rodchenko, for, like Morellet's 16 squares, they represent an extremely clear case of what I would call a strategy of motivation. At stake were the political demands made on art in the Soviet society. The date is 1921 and said most avant-garde artists were on the government payroll, being rewarded for their early support of the Bolshevik power, particularly in accomplishing various thankless tasks during the upheaval, such as preventing hordes of moujiks from cutting boots for themselves out of the Rembrandts of the Hermitage, to use the amusing remark by Seurat's friend, Félix Fénéon. This was a rather ironic situation, it must be noted, given the countless manifestos the same artist had issued before the October Revolution, in which they demanded the old masters be thrown overboard. The most active of them were part of a new institution called INCOOC, an acronym standing for Institute for Artistic Culture, a kind of research center, like the institute here, from which they had recently managed to oust Kandinsky and Gabo, who would soon definitely leave for the West. All the members, Stepanova, Popova, the Sternberg brothers, Medunetsky, Johansson, Rodchenko, and many others, were anxious to define their role in a new collective society which was then, or so they thought, being built. For one thing, they felt obliged to justify their meager salary while so many of their compatriots were starving. It was clear to all of them that the bourgeois individualism of a composition, made of elements balanced according to the artist's taste, was far from responding to the new political and economic demands. A way had to be found to justify artistic labor and its contribution to the building of the new socialist state. Thus, the arbitrariness of individual tastes was to be replaced by a logical, scientific method that would motivate their production. They thus launched something of a debate or competition which would run several months during the spring of 1921. Its explicit purpose was to define what was to be abolished, composition, and what they hoped to replace it with, construction, a term resonant with the Leninist rhetoric of the time, as well as their own fantasies of the artist as engineer. As part of the debate, each participant drew an example of a composition and of a construction. The resulting portfolio, now in the Kostakis collection in Athens, is somewhat disappointing. Either the opposition is confused by a change of technique, sfumato for composition, sharp edge for construction, or by the evocation of a change of medium, a sketch of a painting versus a sketch of a sculpture, or, especially in the case of Vladimir Sternberg, construction is simply understood as anything with a machine look. One contribution stands out. The pair drawn by the very young Carl Jorgensen, obviously one of the smartest artists of his generation. To sum up what construction entails, Jorgensen has sketched 4 different versions of a cross, either right-angled or with obtuse and acute angles. That is, he has emphasized the principle of generation by duplication recalled by Carl André. For the second member of the pair, entitled Plan for a Composition, Still Life, Jorgensen has submitted the drawing of an irregular pentagon within another larger pentagon of the same proportion. It is not so much the irregularity of the figure which is at stake here, but the fact that the pentagon, unlike a cross, cannot be multiplied so as to cover a surface in its entirety. In fact, if one moves within a series of geometric figures in which the number of sides increases, triangle, square, pentagon, hexagon, the pentagon is the first one which cannot be used in a modular fashion. even when it is perfectly regular. If one tries to map a surface with pentagons abutting one another, even a pentagonal surface, one will find that space will always be left between them, gaps that would have to be filled in another fashion with triangles, for example, which is why Provençal tiles are not pentagonal but hexagonal. Now, as soon as Jorgensen submitted his pair of drawings, the debate began to heat up. A conclusion was finally reached unanimously, although only Jorgensen and Rodchenko in his wake were able to immediately act upon it. In short, a construction was said to be based on a scientific mode of organization in which, I quote, no excess materials or elements were involved. The first application of this definition are the sculptures that Jorgensen and Rodchenko present at the May 1921 exhibition of Ommoku, an artist collective grouping most of the younger contributors to the Inkook debate, Rodchenko acting as a senior guest of honor. Jorgensen exhibits a series of constructions based on the cross that look oddly similar to works done by Kenneth Snelson in the 60s, and the color illustration is a Snelson. And for those of you who are interested in the history of engineering, these works by Jorgensen undermine Snelson's claim that he was the first to use a tensegrity structure before Buckminster Fuller. He didn't know about that, of course, but Jorgensen had done it a generation earlier. But unlike Snelson's, Jorgensen's sculptures have a demonstrative wedge. His study in balance, or of balance in particular, was extremely efficient at manifesting the relationship between arbitrariness and excess. Set on an equilateral triangular base, it consists of 3 rods of equal length maintained in space through the tension of a connecting string, which was longer than required. But this excess had a function, almost a pedagogical one. In order to lower the 3 pointed rods and thus transform the sculpture accordingly, at will, one had only to release more of the string's slack. The idea being that the subjective factor of taste or will is monitored as part of the equation and not given some kind of mysterious, unfathomable status. In other words, in contrast to the bourgeois artist's studio secrets, the sculptor's logical mode of production is heralded as a means to oppose the fetishization of artistic inspiration, the romanticization of the artist as creator. The same demonstrative impulse can be found in Rodchenko's contribution to the exhibition, a series of suspended sculptures in which he is beginning to explore what will later be baptized by Michael Fried with regard to Frank Stella's black paintings, the deductive structure. In each of these, a sheet of painted plywood is cut out in concentric shapes, circle, hexagon, rectangle, ellipse, which are then rotated in depth to create various three-dimensional volumes. Each aspect of the work is determined by its material condition, and the process of production is laid bare, even more so, would I say, than in Seurat's little dots. This deductive structure is further explored by Rodchenko after the exhibition in a series of modular sculptures, the one that struck Carl André, for the remarkable economy. Each one of them is made of equal wood blocks, and the plan is sometimes equal to the elevation, as in the reconstruction here in color. And so it is that when Carl André declared that these sculptures offered, I quote, a great alternative to the semi-surrealist work of the 50s, such as Giacometti, and to the late Cubism of David Smith, he had plenty of reasons to do so. For what Rodchenko's work tried to eliminate in 1921 is echoed in André's minimalist sculpture of close to 50 years later, namely the presence of man, not only as a theme, as with Giacometti, but also as a subjective agent, the author who arranges, puts together, composes various elements into a unity that he or she has imagined according to his or her personal taste and will. For Rodchenko, the I had to be replaced by the collective we, the pronoun of both science and of the new socialist community. But the problem lies precisely there. Despite Carl André's famous pose as a Marxist artist, he never envisioned his work as an hymn to rational thought or to progress. On the contrary, he shared with his minimalist colleagues a total distrust for these, which were seen by them as nightmarish products of the Enlightenment and thus as bourgeois inventions. Minimalist ordering, the one thing after another, to use Donald Judd's famous phrase, was never intended as a metaphor for the social order that was to come, as glorifying reason. If man was to be effaced, thought the minimalist, then his highest achievements and most of it his rational thought had to be annulled. This is what Donald Judd is most adamant about in the interview with Glaser that I mentioned earlier. It is also the very meaning of Frank Stella's brutal dismissal in the same interview of what he calls the relational aesthetic, which he sees at the core of the European tradition of abstract art. Finally, it is what structures Saul LeWitt's paradoxal distinction between logic and reason. I quote, "In a logical thing, each part is dependent on the last. It follows in a certain sequence as part of the logic. But a rational thing is something you have to make a rational decision on each time. You have to think about it. In a logical sequence, you don't think about it. It's a way of not thinking. It's irrational." No doubt, Rodchenko's and Johansson's culture were logical. But no doubt as well, their makers would have been dumbfounded to hear them be called irrational. In fact, they would have resented this qualification, though they would have understood it in a manner altogether different from LeWitt's. For it would have brought to their minds Malevich and his claim to go beyond reason. That is to say, it would have brought to their mind one of the paternal figures from whom they wanted most to secede. How then can we approach the non-compositional drive in the history of 20th century art? Given that the specific intentions of their makers were often quite diverse, at times even literally opposed, is it foolish to compare Rodchenko's modular sculpture with Stella's black painting, as did Carl André, or with André's own works, or to compare more or less 16 squares with Van Doesburg's arithmetic composition, as I suggested? Would such comparisons be an example of what Erwin Panofsky called pseudomorphism? Not necessarily. All these works do have something in common. They all manifest an urge to suppress composition as sheer arbitrariness and to motivate the practice of art by way of some ordering principle that would not depend upon subjective choice. But the meaning of this non-compositional drive varies in history. Not a single one of the artists I just mentioned would agree with the other as to the signification of what he is doing. There's no she in this list. What I would like to propose here, in the time left at my disposal, is both a map of the different formal possibilities of this drive toward impersonality in 20th century art and a brief chronology, so that, hopefully, our assessment of similarities and differences escapes the pseudomorphism and allows us to perceive recurring patterns of development. I will situate the beginning of my shorthand narrative with the advent of abstraction, for during the years separating Seurat and the birth of abstract art, which is about 30 years, impersonality in art did not fare so well. Liberated from the burden of representation, but also pondering over the responsibility in front of the void that such a liberation had engendered, artists had to justify for themselves and for the audience what they were doing. One possibility was to revert to the romantic idea of the total freedom of the artist, the arbitrariness of the poet that does not suffer any law above him, of the Athenaeum. This is a route taken by Kandinsky as expressed in On the Spiritual in Art of 1912 and many subsequent essays, and I chose to show a late work by Kandinsky, you'll see later why. What I paint are the deepest falls of my very own soul, my very own Gefühl, fully accessible to me and to me alone, of which I nevertheless claim to offer you a truthful portrait. Take it or leave it. This notion of the work of art as a seismograph of the artist's psyche lies beyond all expressionist conception of art. It resurfaces from time to time and could be heard barely altered during abstract expressionism heyday. It is against this highly subjective solution that what I call the strategies of motivation began to develop almost simultaneously, particularly non-compositional strategies, which are the ones I'm considering here. These strategies are not of an infinite number. And before unfolding my promised narrative, I would like to enumerate them. They can be divided, I think, into 6 categories. The least frequently summoned is chance, perhaps because it bears some dangers. To be sure, chance undermines subjectivity, but it might also end up throwing the baby, that is, the very possibility of painting or sculpturing, with the bathwater. The other possibilities are all indexical operations in which the paintings or sculptures fall back onto themselves. The grid, the collapse of image and field, the deductive structure, the monochrome, the process. In each of these indexical operations, there is a reduplication of one property of the painting or sculpture or to itself. And to speak like Rodchenko and his friends, there is no excess. A modular grid retraces the proportions of the supported maps, the image of a flag by Jasper Johns, the pattern of a black painting by Stella, the processual marks of a Ryman, you have Ryman and Johns here, the canvas, fill the canvas as does a single color of a monochrome by Yve-Alain, which you have here. Some artists use several of these strategies simultaneously or successively, and all these categories are themselves porous. A grid or a monochrome represent also a collapse of fill and image. A monochrome is also a grid with only one square, etc. So that's the frame. Let's add the narrative now. If I had to write the history of modernist art from the point of view of the non-compositional strategies of motivation, I would divide it into 4 periods, or rather, I would understand it as a game played 4 times differently. The first play would be dominated, as I mentioned before, by the birth of abstract art in the second decade of this century, this past century. The earliest examples of grids are Giacomo Balla's Compenetrazione Iridescente of 1912, and the earliest deductive structure is Robert Delaunay's Disque Simultané of 1913. It is interesting to note that both artists clearly refer to Seurat and to the simultaneous contrast, but it must also be said that these works were flukes. Neither artist knew exactly what he was doing, nor why, and then soon returned to traditional relational modes of composition. Then, in 1914, Duchamp's Bolerac, his first unassisted ready-made, is an obvious case of fusion of field and image. This interpretation of Duchamp's groundbreaking act is certainly anachronistic. It was proposed by Donald Judd, who focused on the wholeness of the ready-made object as an attack on relational aesthetic. But I don't think that the charge of anachronism is enough to dismiss it. A year after Duchamp's ready-made come a certain number of suprematist canvases exhibited by Malevich in 1915, the black square, the red square, the black cross, and other deductive structure of the sort. Malevich sets the tone. He is the first abstract artist to claim that he is searching for the absolute, which he calls the zero of form. Still, a year later, much lesser known, are Jean Arp and Sophie Tauber-Arp's duo collages. With them, the claim for impersonality becomes more pronounced. I quote, "We felt the personality to be burdensome and useless, since it had developed in the world now petrified and lifeless. We thought new materials unburdened by tradition. The results were rigorous and impersonal constructions of surfaces and colors. Any element of chance was eliminated. No spot, no rip, no fiber, no inaccuracy was to perturb the clarity of our work. For our paper pictures, we even discarded scissors, which we had originally used, but which all too readily betrayed the life of the hand. We used a paper cutter instead." Should be noted here, is the insistence upon the suppression of chance, for it went paradoxically hand in hand, or very shortly thereafter, with Arp's own exploration of chance, which are mentioned actually in the same retrospective text I just quoted, as a means of obtaining the elimination of all volition, that is, of subjectivity, just as in the grid of the duo collage he had just referred to. Scores have been written on Dada's anti-rationalism as a reaction against the absurdity of World War I. The end of this decade is marked by Mondrian's foray into non-composition with his 9 modular grids of 1918-1919, but also by the first serious doubts concerning the very possibility of absolute non-compositionality. Both Duchamp and Mondrian, in fact, realized that the eradication of subjectivity was not so easy to achieve. as is evident from Duchamp's extreme caution in choosing his ready-made objects, as well as from Mondrian's rejection of the modular grid in 1920 in order to elaborate his highly compositional neoplastic style. The second wave of non-compositional art can be detected after World War I, this time with a distinctively positivist slant. This is the moment when the in-cook debate takes place, and slightly later, the invention of unism by the Polish artist Władysław Stremiński, who was perhaps the most articulate of all the early proponents of abstract art. It is from that time that the first monochromes proper date, respectively Rodchenko, which you see here, triptych of 1921, and Stremiński. But the deductive structure is a highlight of the period. We owe its best exploration to the same two artists. With regard to Rodchenko, not only is this evident in the sculptures I mentioned before, but also in a series of prints and paintings related to his reflection on the nature of line. Somewhat later, in the late 20s, the deductive structure will become the main non-compositional strategy of Stremiński, who develops a full-blown theory of it, according to which the division of the picture's surface must be determined by the proportion of its material support. Unlike their immediate predecessors, who were driven by a genuine anxiety about the possibility of fully justifying their art, Rodchenko, Stremiński, and the artists of this generation did not have to establish the viability of abstract art themselves. That job had already been done by Mondrian, Malevich, and their peers. This is perhaps why they are deeply steeped in a form of socio-political and technological optimism. Stremiński alone loses faith in the future, and it is not by chance that he abandons his highly elaborated non-compositional strategy as soon as the combined dangers of Hitlerism and Stalinism loom on the horizon. But his final demise of humanism is also internal. At some point, he posited an ideal proportion for all his canvases, thus eliminating the very notion of a deductive structure solely based on the hic et nunc of the support. As one might expect, this ideal proportion was supposedly based on those of man, although I find it very hard to see the proportion of 8/5 have to do with man. But once again, subjectivity, if not as agency, at least as a theme, proves hard to eliminate for long. It is also during this period that what I would call the bad dream, the potentially authoritarian version of the non-compositional drive, begins to appear with the notion of a purely mathematical art that will be entirely programmed through an a priori set of permutational rules, a notion entirely antithetical to Stremiński's struggle against all forms of a priori projection. Initiated shortly before his death by Theo van Doesburg in 1930, this so-called mathematical tendency in art is developed by the Swiss artists Max Bill and Richard Paul Lohse in the late 30s. In looking at the dull portfolio of 15 variations on a single theme, published by Max Bill in 1938, which you have on the screen here, one cannot but think of Adorno's stern condemnation of the serialism of late Schoenberg as a defeat of art in its fight against the rationality of the administrated world and the bourgeois ideal of global domination of nature. Yet it is not only a defeat, claims Adorno, but a total surrender, an ultimate reconciliation. The agency of man has indeed been effaced in such an art, but the negativity of the non-compositional impulse geared towards the erasure of the artist as a bourgeois dominator of his material has produced the author as slave of the authoritarian system of rationalization that his fight was designed to combat. The third act of this narrative immediately follows World War II. In America, the phenomenon originates within the ranks of the abstract expressionists, usually praised, on the contrary, for the high subjectivism of their art. Both Pollock's all-over drips and Barney Newman's use of bilateral symmetry or oversized canvases can be seen as assaults against composition, and would be interpreted indeed as such by future generations of artists. Pollock's and Newman's rejection of the tasteful art of balance common to European post-cubist art emerged in part from a highly competitive and slightly nationalistic atmosphere and a desire to start everything anew. It cast their art, in any case, in a wholly different category from that of other abstract expressionists. Pollock eliminated the bodily link that made of the brush the continuation of the hand, and thus of the gesture the handwriting of the artist. And he allowed gravity, that is, a process that is independent from his agency, to play a major role in the configuration of his skeins. As for Newman, he reinvented symmetry as a deductive structure. This time, however, not as a cipher of a 0 degree of art, but as the score of a beginning that must be endlessly enacted. Newman, in fact, reintroduced man into the equation, not the personality of the artist, but man as a subject of perception being given a sense of place, as he said, in front of the canvas he beholds. In Europe, in the late 40s and early 50s, Ellsworth Kelly patiently explored the whole gamut of 4 of the strategies that I mentioned before: index, chance, grid, monochrome, in an effort to dispel Picasso's overbearing shadow. Non-composition was then understood by Kelly as a way of not having to invent, that is, of not having to cope to Picasso, who had invented it all. At the same time, Kelly's friend François Morellet was attacking rationalism as a philosophy that brought the world to Auschwitz and Hiroshima, devoting his entire energy to undoing the mathematical stance of Max Bill to the production of systematic work based on chance, and taking up again the ironical dimension of non-compositionality that had been abandoned after Dada. The last phase of modernist non-composition, on which I'll have to be super brief, can be seen as an explicit reaction against expressionism in America and against informal painting in Europe. It extends from the mid-50s to the 70s at least, if not to the present, and I would tend to link into a certain kind of cultural pessimism, only momentarily interrupted by the social unrest of the late 60s. This most recent chapter is well known, and the artists themselves have usually been extremely eloquent about the issue, from Jasper Johns and Kenneth Nolan's Target to Frank Stella's black paintings to Warhol, then to minimalism and process art, from Yves Klein's monochromes to Daniel Buren's endlessly repeated stripes, from Richard Serra's torn sheets of lead or piled up slabs, to Ryman's painstaking brushstrokes that generate and are generated by the proportions and structure of the support. Countless examples can be found. This stylistic diversity helps measure the potentiality of non-composition, while the careers of most of the artists I just mentioned reveals a nearly universal abandonment of the non-compositional in their later work. So this is a general framework, the overall historical canvas. Many things have been left out in this fast-paced account, but it is the nature of a chart to provide ample room for subsequent insertions. I would like to address one last issue to which I allude, as I did from time to time in the course of this talk, and I'm nearly finished. How is it that, invariably, the non-compositional fails, if we accept the limit case of Max Biel, maybe? How is it that this drive never holds very long, that men always seem to return? Look at Sol LeWitt, whose early works provide perhaps as hardcore a non-compositionality as Morelet's 16 Squares. Nothing was more impersonal than his early wall drawings, each presented with a diagram explaining its configuration. And you have that on an early work on the left and the right of LeWitt and then of Ryman. Few things are more arbitrary to the point of being decorative than the frescoes LeWitt had been doing for the last 20 years. Or look at Robert Ryman. Does not his recent work loom strangely toward the Parisian informel of the 50s? And Stella, how long did he keep the course of the deductive structure? Did he not turn Kandinsky, whom he so despised at the time of the black paintings, into his hero? Once again, early and late work. One after the other, the evolution of each non-compositional artist seemed to reach a point after which, progressively or abruptly, the wheel turns back on itself. And that is not a new phenomenon. Some artists died before they reached this point, but right from the start, right from the sound bite of Delaunay's disc, the non-compositional revealed itself to be unsustainable. What could this mean? Perhaps that within the modernist search for the absolute, of which I've tried to chart a version, there has always been two possibilities. The logical one is to go as far as one can go and then stop altogether. This is the path taken by Rodchenko when he painted his monochrome triptych at the end of 1921. I quote, I reduced painting to its logical conclusion and exhibited 3 canvases, red, yellow, and blue. I affirmed it's all over, basic colors, every plane is a plane, and there is to be no more representation. 1921. But this radical move is impossible to sustain as well. Rodchenko, in his later career, just like Stravinsky after he had abandoned unism, resumed compositional painting, so long for logic. Then there's a full acceptance of failure, which is perhaps the only path of hope. As I said, that was in some ways Mondrian's route after 1919. But it also was that of Duchamp, even though he pretended for many years having stopped working. I quote Duchamp, "I consider bad taste, in fact bad or good, the greatest enemy of art. In the case of the ready-made, I tried to remain aloof from personal taste and to be fully conscious of the problem. Of course, all this squarely sustained a transcendental discussion, because many people can prove I'm wrong by merely pointing out that I choose one object rather than another and thus impose something of my own personal taste. Again, I say man is not perfect, but at least I've tried to remain as aloof as possible and don't think for 1 minute that this hasn't been a difficult task." End of quote. The conclusion basically is, man is not perfect. If he was, he would since long have found a way to void himself. Thank you. Yes.
Yve-Alain is happy to answer some questions. Awesome.
Yve-Alain, thank you for the lecture. I suppose the experiments of absolute non-compositionality didn't lead in giving prizes, but I'm interested in how they thought the wider culture of the art world should be changed. So in the case of, for instance, St. Petersburg in the 1920s, which you describe so vividly, having prevented the paintings being cut up for boots, how were the older paintings displayed and what happened to them?
The collections of the... all the artists, as soon as during the revolution, they banded together to come and actually guard the Hermitage and the collection. And then they created very, very quickly a ministry within the Ministry of Culture, we financed their work. They created all kinds of committees to reorganize museum culture. So the museum was understood as a kind of greater as a kind of pedagogical enterprise, in which they would disseminate a little bit throughout Russia, create museums a little bit everywhere. But the whole idea was that to try to bring the masses to the museum so that they have a very, very linear teleological account of the history of art, of Western art from the Renaissance on, including their work. The state bought their work. Tons and tons of works of the avant-garde were bought by the state. And many of these artists were self-appointed, in a way, curators of museum of Western art throughout Russia. Self-appointed because, in fact, they had been there to, the traditional, the curators were always aristocrats, like in Europe, actually, at the time, or left. So the museums there was a vacuum, and then there was support to do that job for a good, until the late 20s, by which time the NonComPros, the Commissariat for Culture and Enlightenment, decided to purge all the museum and all the cultural institutions from artistic loonies and to put true bureaucrats in charge. That's also the moment where the works of the avant-garde went from the galleries and museums into the basement, to which they have only now, in the last 10 years, come out.
Other questions?
Yes, Eric. Sure.
More or less at the same time. Do you have a
No, it did. Poetry did. No, it did. Starting with Mallarmé, it did very much. And there are different versions of that, but it did. Poetry with Mallarmé was one of the theoreticians of impersonality in poetry very early on. And when you think about, in music, for example, the introduction of chants with Cage, that was also in poetry. I mean, and even in, as absurd as it might sound, even in novels, there's a whole novel written by Michel Butor in the 50s in France called, I think, Perpetuum mobile, which is like a book where you can flip half the page or little strips to do your narrative yourself. So it's kind of an absurd book, true, but nevertheless there was a tendency. No, they, it varies, I think. It varies. There were moments where there was a big knowledge from one artist, from the artist in one medium in connection to the other medium, but it's not one. And sometimes there's complete misunderstanding. For example, Kandinsky thought that he understood Schoenberg very much as a kind of, the completely expressionist. He had no idea about Schoenberg's seriality and not much. He could not, and when he understood what Schoenberg was doing, he didn't like it anymore. But in general, often it's more parallel with sometimes points of contact, but it's more parallel but still today, you don't have a lot of fusion between artists and writers, for example. It's quite striking, actually, in America. But there are moments, for example, a man like Saul LeWitt and the minimalist artists of his generation were very, very, very aware of the French Nouveau Roman, very much. And LeWitt was a great reader of someone like Beckett, and was very much interested in the complete absurdity. In fact, this image that I showed, which is 120 variations for an open cube of LeWitt, was compared by Rosalind Krauss in a very beautiful essay to the whole section of the novel of Beckett called Molloy, where the bum is sucking stones on the beach and try to count how many stones he's sucking thing, and making sure he doesn't suck the same stone twice, and you have stones full of his pocket. It's completely, and LeWitt's way of doing, math is that of kindergarten. It's completely ridiculous. It's like he cannot say etc. It's completely, and that's very close to the notion of the Beckett, slightly deranged narrator in Molloy. So no, there are moments where artists are very, very interested and know a lot about, and I mentioned Cage because he had a huge impact on the visual arts. Many artists, actually, visual artists, followed his classes, and they didn't really want to be musicians. They wanted to learn from Cage all notion of indeterminacy and chance and so forth. So there are moments like that. There is never a clear-cut, complete, umbrella in which everything goes at the same rhythm. Thank God, because it would be pretty boring if everything was always the same. But yeah, Erin? No, no, but they are.
That's right. And one point where there was a real overlap is in this business of the grid. When you put the squares on the floor, they are to be seen in perspective. And that's exactly what happened when perspective was invented in the 15th century, based on exactly that kind of grid of squares that diminished. There seems to be some echo of...
Well, there are a couple of there are, let's say, things that I like to split hairs. In the 30s, it is true that for a great many of artists engaged in this kind of thing, there was a kind of ideal notion of the ideal, but never to do with ideal proportions. So they were against the notion of going back to humanism. There was no ideal proportion, but the notion that you could find something which didn't need to be materialized because it would be so perfectly formulated a priori. And that was why von Duisburg appealed to arithmetic. I mean, his math was pretty, as you could see, it's pretty much kindergarten math also. But nevertheless, within the 30s, and Max Biel was his heir. I never pronounced that word very well. Was his the follower, and for him, he gives the title of many of his work have equations. I mean, that was true, and it is also true that in the 20s, though, the generation before, or not generation, but like 15 years, the constructivists, that is also true that they saw their work as part of, a utopian. They saw their work as a kind of utopian model of a new society to come, where everything would be perfect, of course. And so, as far as the minimalists are concerned, I think that they themselves always, and Carl André is one of them, were always very, very careful, and they fail at that, to dismiss any kind of utopian or idealistic interpretation of their work. I mean, Carl André was told many times what you just told, but your work had like perspective. What are you talking about? Well, he didn't want to recognize it, and they always insisted their work had nothing to do with ideal geometry, Cartesianism on the contrary, and all that. So, but I do agree that they failed in a way to convey that sense. I mean, if you don't want to look ideal, then don't use geometry. That's quite simple. But nevertheless, that's what they did.
Your argument seems correct in response to that question as to painting and sculpture, but in terms of architecture, which would seem to encompass some of the positions that you've been taking, their ideal certainly was social and political in terms of what they were doing.
Yeah.
Do you have any comments about architecture?
Not really, but because but it is true. I should work on this issue with regard to architecture. The architects don't usually formulate this question exactly the same way, except at one moment, which is in the 30s, and it's interesting because it's by a poet who was a very, very interesting art critic and wrote a lot of things. He was a Czech poet called Karel Tiger. Tiger wrote an attack on Le Corbusier's plan for a new museum and things like that in the 30s, and as pure composition, pure bourgeois composition, and it's not a construction. Why it's not a construction? Because it's not motivated by any logic. The logic is purely the choice of, So in 1930, that was a moment where there was this interest in several little magazines of architecture in Europe at the time. But I don't think that usually they use the same opposition, composition, construction, for example, that were used in. I would have to. I don't know enough of the full art. I know this one particular moment which is very clear. It's crystal clear. The debate there is the same. And in literature at that time, in Russian literature, there's this extraordinary big. There's this very young scholar working on Tretjakov and the literature in Russia at the end of the 20s in Russia. We really have the same idea of how do you do a construction in poetry as opposed to bourgeois composition. So there are moments like that, let's say the constructivist movement in Russia and in the countries that followed. the Russian model, like Czechoslovakia, basically this whole part of the world. That debate was almost the same in every discipline, even in music actually. But that's a fairly short episode, I think, from 1921, and then after 22, when the blockade was on until World War II. Yes?
I noticed that you stop around 1970. You stop tracing this
Yeah.
depersonalization. What happens in the 80s? Can you trace it into contemporary practice, or does something happen in the 80s to completely?
I think the 80s are my bad object. I think it returns in the 90s, but the 80s are. Well, I think when I speak with young artists, that they are, very interested in the 70s now. It's a kind of return of the repressed for them, and fascinated by those debates. But you can, go in, for example, one of the heroes of the young generation now is Gordon Matta Clark, who is surely really constantly negotiating the difficulties between what's a composition and what's a non-composition in his own work. How can the form be generated by the process, or is the form generating all these kind of things are very crucial from his work. And by the way, you should go and see his retrospective at the Whitney Museum, which is extraordinary because a lot of works that have never been shown before are there. So, and I think that many young artists today, they could cite your example, but I don't have any images. So yes, I said it could go into now, and I could certainly, and especially in media which I don't know very well, like video. It's a constant thought about many young video practitioners today is specifically because the form is so open to pure aleatory and pure randomness, to have to find a way to justify to motivate, as I say, what they are doing is crucial, and they think a lot about it. Not exactly in those terms, but that's what they think about. So I could do part 2 but that would be a different talk.
I think perhaps now we should adjourn the discussion to Ford Hall and thank Yve-Alain again.